So what I want to do today, following along the lines of what Arnhart does in his chapter, but a particular interest of mine is combining political thought with issues of international relations and foreign policy. And so I wanted to focus in today on Augustinian foreign policy and Arnhart's view of the scholar Morgenthau. And you have some handouts there. What I handed you was, there's several things. One is just a discussion of what Augustine probably had access to at his time from the Bible. What we now term the Bible in one book was not all in one book at that point, but he probably had access to the entire New Testament. Oh, and I was going to bring a Bible in today because there was a particular quote I wanted to read, but I'll try to bring that in next time. And then on the other side is just some of the key thoughts from Augustine, and especially related to political realism. And then you have another handout, and that's particularly about Morgenthau's international thought. And I want to say, just for your understanding, that the top list is all Morgenthau's recommendations, okay? And the bottom three in that bottom list are things that you should avoid. So if you read that and if you didn't know that, you might be a little confused. But in Scientific Man versus Power Politics, he says, these are the things that you should avoid. So, all right, so we'll get to all of that today. All right, so what would Augustinian foreign policy look like? Well, we have to travel a little bit outside of the readings that you have to get a full picture of this, but we do know, we have learned, even within our short selection, that Augustine separates the city of man and the city of God. And both exist on earth, but one also has a heavenly existence. So it straddles now, here and now, with eternity. But the earthly city, he says, is a place we all live in. And that's because Christians and everybody else alike are sinners. And the world that we have made for ourselves is always going to be marked with sin and injustice because of that, because we're fallen from grace, okay? And in the earthly city, the worldly situation is that there are many different types of government, actually. Some good, some bad, okay? And some very bad. But we will find Augustine always says people must bear whatever government God gives them, basically. Augustine is one of those people who thinks that God is in charge of everything. And so if people live under a tyrannical government, there must be a purpose for that. We've seen him, when he reasoned about the sack of Rome, trying very hard to find a reason and a purpose. Well, he does the same thing with unjust government. It's not for us to decide. In other words, it's not for us to judge. And so that makes him different from some future Christian thinkers who applied moral standards directly to, whether government was acceptable to God or not, okay? So his position is, if it exists, it's acceptable to God. And actually, that's somewhat similar to the position of Thomas Hobbes, who said that we must accept, any type of government, even and maybe especially absolute government, which we may call a tyranny, but we really don't have any right to resist. Okay, God puts it in place, all right, and so it's there for a reason. So Augustine agrees with that. Now he says there's also the heavenly city, and the part that exists on earth is represented by the church and includes all Christian believers, but it is imperfect in this world, precisely because all people are sinners, which includes members of the church. And so the church can be corrupt, it can be very imperfect, and it only can exist, the city, heavenly city can only exist and does exist in perfection only in the next life. So that adds realism too, because Augustine isn't one of these people who's going to say, the church is God's representative on earth, therefore it should rule because the church leaders will do way better than worldly leaders. He doesn't agree with that. okay? Because everybody is a sinner. And if we put people into positions of power, anybody is likely to be corrupted by that, okay? That doesn't mean that he totally says there's no obligation of the church or of Christian believers to be involved in politics, however. But it's just that he doesn't, he is not one who thinks that the world would necessarily be a better place if the church ruled. So, as we discussed last time, he rejects the idea of theocracy, for instance, okay? But he does say that the religion's aims can be compatible with the aims of the state because, he says, if we are thinking rightly, we can see that there are some things that the government does that protects us, that keeps us safe, okay? To the extent that government does that, its aims are compatible with the right aims of the church, because the church should want people to be safe and for there to be law and order as well. And it can make statements about the effectiveness of the law and order within a society, okay? And one of the things that I want to dwell on today, and we'll get to this in a bit, but is that Augustine starts a sort of just war teaching. He makes some comments, not nearly as elaborate as some of the future medieval thinkers, but he makes some comments on just war. And the whole just war teaching is another demonstration of his realism, okay? Because he accepts war. He accepts war as something that will occur again and again. And as we'll see, it's caused by the human condition, basically, which in this life cannot be changed. So the best we can do is try to apply some standards to it. It's sometimes very necessary, but it doesn't mean that we give up all judgment, okay? All right, so the church's aims can be compatible with the state, but as I said, it's not to be involved with ruling. And he doesn't have any sort of natural law teaching, such as came later with thinkers like Aquinas, in which, you know, they set up these standards and said natural law is God's law. God, you know, put these standards into place, and therefore, if government is unjust, it's against God's will, okay? And then, therefore, we can change it. We can revolt against it, or we can do what it takes to change it. Augustine does not do any of that, okay? Later Christian thinkers do. The natural law tradition in Western thought emanates from the Christian influence in the Middle Ages. But Augustine is not the originator of that, okay? So there's nowhere where you're going to see Augustine say, you know, that government is unjust, it should be toppled. He's not going to make any argument like that, because that government must be there for a reason. We must accept it, okay? All right, so given that, it is maybe somewhat surprising that Augustine doesn't just throw up his hands and say, well, we can't pass judgment on any of government's actions if it's God's will that it exists. But he doesn't do that, okay? Instead, he does try to apply some moral standards to political action. He does talk about, for instance, good Christian leadership as opposed to, you know, bad Christian leadership or bad pagan leadership, okay? And the area that I want to focus on for a little while is just war, and then more broadly, foreign policy, and then American foreign policy. We'll talk about that too. But we have some elements of just war theory in Augustine's thought, okay? And this goes beyond what you read, so don't be thinking, oh, where did I read that? You didn't read it really. But it's something that we should know about, because we'll revisit later on how some of these other medieval thinkers view war, and whether there can be justice in war, and if so, what does it look like? So what we find in Augustine is, first of all, his explanation for why we have war, okay? And one of the things that he points out, going all the way back to the Bible story of the Tower of Babel, is that, you know, there are many, many different languages in the world and many different cultures. And this causes automatic misunderstanding, okay? And so it's very difficult for people to even be able to understand each other, and these differences cause mistrust and conflict. Okay? Of course, he also emphasizes the human desire for power, which is just a part of our sinful nature, that we're full of pride. So anytime we see an opportunity to try to dominate, we have an instinct or desire to do so. And we have differences in laws and religions, which he also blames. So, the human condition is full of divisions, in other words. Okay? And this is the way it is. And it's a mystery, I think, to Augustine. Why did God set it up this way? Probably as a punishment, as, the Tower of Babel story tells us, for original sin, for the temptation to have power. So when the tower was destroyed, people went out of it speaking all sorts of different languages. And the idea was that they wouldn't be able to cooperate, ever again and do something that would challenge God's authority. Okay? But for whatever reason, we're in this situation where these differences often lead to conflict. They're the cause of war. And so rather than just simply accepting that completely, Augustine tries to develop some standards for judging whether the decision to go to war is good or not. And we call this aspect of just war doctrine Jus Ad Bellum, okay, justice of war. And this is really as far as Augustine goes. It's about, is the decision to go to war just or not, okay? And some of the criteria that he develops are, first of all, proper authority, okay, which is really for him just the legitimate leader of a country. In other words, you can't have some member of a faction within the country or some other, rival emperor, something like that, deciding to go to war to stir up trouble. That's unjust. Okay? So the person or people who should make that decision are the legitimate leaders of the land. But legitimate doesn't mean democratically elected or, liked by people. Okay? Just the people who are actually in charge. Okay? Now here's an important one, and this comes through all the way through to today, as far as, so does the first one, although we've redefined it as legitimate has to be either elected by the people or at least approved by the people. But this one we all accept if we accept just war doctrine at all, and that is that the just war is defensive or in response to a wrong. I mean, some people just leave it at defensive. The only good war is a defensive war. But Augustine and many just war thinkers that followed him also said in response to a wrong, because if you can't respond to a wrong, then you invite more conflict. You basically have to punish a wrong. Let's say, an enemy country invades part of your territory and you push them back, okay? If all you do is push them back, you do perhaps invite a more frequent attempt, okay? But if you take something from them, if it makes sense to punish them in some other way, then maybe they might think twice. So if you do something else, it has to be with the intention of deterring future attacks, okay? If you do nothing at all, of course, they're going to keep coming. Finally, or not finally, but thirdly, it has to be done out of necessity, and that's the last resort criteria. Okay? You have to show that you've attempted any sort of diplomatic means that you are at your disposal. Sometimes nothing is at your disposal. You have no means of conducting diplomacy. But if you do, if there's something else you could do short of war, then you should do it. And finally, there needs to be just intentions. And this became problematic as just war theory was developed, because especially when secular thinkers took it up, they said, well, how can you judge the leader's intentions? They can say what their intentions are just to reestablish peace, but you could never know people's intentions, okay? But as a Christian thinker, Augustine thought if a Christian leader, okay, which is really what he's aiming these teachings at, if a Christian leader is thinking about whether to go to war or not, he needs to examine his own intentions, okay? and ask himself, am I doing this for revenge, for instance, or just because I hate these people? Or am I doing it to obtain a more lasting peace? Am I doing it to redress an injury that's happened to me, happened to my country, which if I do will lead to a more peaceful situation in the long run? Okay? So all of these are influenced by his particular Christian view. Okay? And you can think about the reverse of these. Obviously the reverse of them are to have, just some factional leader or gang or, some element like that make the decision, and then basically you've got a civil war as well as all of the other problems. An aggressive war is never justified in his view, okay? A war of conquest. So a lot of what the Romans had done in their past from this perspective would be unjust. It can't, a lot of wars happen as a first resort, right, as the first reaction without due care to what can be done to prevent them. And of course, many are bad intentions. So this is what we get from Augustine, and later on we have another set of criteria added to this, Jus Ad Bellum, which is it concerns how you conduct the war. And when we get to Aquinas and some of these other thinkers, we'll revisit that. Okay? But you can see that Augustine, as a Christian thinker, is trying to come up with some standards by which to judge the decision and inform at least Christian leaders who might actually take this thought seriously and help them to make good decisions. It doesn't mean that he would ever justify revolting against a leader who made a bad decision, but he's not simply accepting any and all actions from leaders, obviously. So, any questions about Augustine's sort of bare bones just war doctrine? It's just the beginning. It's just a sort of hint, and it is a little problematic because on the one hand, Augustine says we have to accept even tyrannical government, okay, because God put it there. And on the other hand, he says, but we can evaluate decisions of leaders with these criteria in mind. And there is a little bit of a problem there philosophically, because if everything is really God's will, and you really take that seriously, you might very well conclude that the best thing to do is just to shut up and accept everything. But he doesn't do that. So it's later Christian thinkers try to address that problem in more detail and with more sophistication and with more of an emphasis on human free will as an element that allows us to make these decisions, right? And also to not accept whatever we're given. They backed away from the idea that all government is there because God put it there. Okay? Some government is there because people are sinners and they decided to, become tyrannical. Yes?
Does Augustine have this theory that, even though it's God's will, that people can still make it better? Is that what he's trying to get at? But he's not just saying that, this tyrannical ruler is here, you just have to deal with it, but maybe it's like making the best out of any situation, but you just can't overthrow every government.
Yeah, he seems to have a spirit of wanting to make things better, definitely. Whether he can totally justify it based on his own assumptions, maybe not. But definitely he does want, and a lot of his commentary has to do with making things better, trying to raise the standards up. So he's not a complete and utter realist, but he will never go so far as to say, these are the standards, and if government doesn't comply with them, then it's bad, and we should get rid of it. He will never say that. We have to accept it. Okay? We can try to make it better, but we cannot justify overthrow of a government. Yeah. So that's about the best we can do as far as understanding his position. At times he sounds like a total fatalist, The followers of Calvin have a similar sort of dilemma when they talk about, the elect. They say that if you're a member of the elect, you are a member of the elect. God's chosen before you were even born, because God knows everything that's going to happen, and He's chosen all of the people who will be His people, okay, before any of us were born. So if we take that totally seriously, there's no room for free will, and there's no point in doing good in this world, because, basically your fate is sealed. So in practice, people moved away from the predestination argument because it didn't allow for any sort of real human input, And then what's the point in reading the Bible, going to church, following the rules and so forth? So it remains a problem for people who believe in an omnipotent and omniscient God, that you have to somehow deal with that plus human free will. Okay, and there is a way to do it, but it's a problem. All right, any other questions so far? Okay. Well, Arnhart asks this question: can realism be moral, basically, or can realism be just? And if so, how? Can we see Augustine's realism and his acceptance of war, even if he does have some standards that he'd like to be applied, and his acceptance of human conflict and the sinfulness that underlies it, and his acceptance of unjust regimes and so forth? Can this type of position be seen as moral, or does it compromise too much with the immorality and sinfulness of the world? Well, in order to deal with that question, Arnhart turns to a modern-day Augustinian, Hans Morgenthau, who learned a lot from Augustine, though he was a Jewish thinker. But he learned a lot from Augustine and some other Catholic thinkers, because they developed this tradition of Christian realism. So he wrote, these are some of the most famous books that he wrote. This was back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, okay? Politics Among Nations, In Defense of the National Interest, and Scientific Man versus Power Politics. And I've read all of these, and they're really, really good. If you ever have any time and you want to, they're all about international relations, but they're really works of political thought. And, they really make you think. So Morgenthau saw the world very much like Augustine. He called original sin animus domini, the desire for power. Okay? So he took out from his thought sort of the cosmic view of the fall of man and things like that. Not that he didn't believe in it necessarily, but when he was dealing with international politics, he simply said, it's obvious that human beings are driven by the desire for power. Okay, this is an aspect of human nature that will be with us forever. In Scientific Man, he said, reason, far from following its own inherent impulses, is driven towards its goals by the irrational forces, the ends of which it serves. So the way he sees most people is that their reason is not in control, like Plato wanted it to be, right? But rather their passions are in control, and their reason follows finding out how to get what it is they want. Okay? So we can be very smart and very strategic, but most of the time we use our intelligence to get what we desire. Okay? So the world will always be a dangerous place, according to Morgenthau, just like Augustine would say. And he, in his writing, attacks idealism, what he calls rationalism, which is this belief that you can apply scientific reason to political problems and solve them once and forever. He was not a big fan of the United Nations, for instance, and the whole idea of world government, or before it, the League of Nations, because he felt like those were attempts to try to come up with a rational scheme that if only everybody was rational and saw their rational self-interest, then they would, of course, cooperate, and this would work. But Morgenthau says people aren't rational, and So if you try to develop something like a world government, what you'll get is world tyranny, perhaps, or you'll get endless conflicts because you'll give people an arena in which they can argue more, okay? Or the world government, or United Nations in our case, will be taken over by a few governments and used for their purposes, but you won't get people actually cooperating in a rational way, even though it makes total sense, okay? Because that's not the way people are. And he thought it was actually kind of a dangerous thing to try to apply these idealistic ideas, because while we are pursuing a foreign policy of idealism, we're not taking care of the business we can take care of to protect our own country. So he was very critical of Woodrow Wilson, for instance, who, started the League of Nations in order to try to bring world peace. And he thought that World War I was the last war, the war to end all wars, because now we had learned enough that we would, cooperate through this League of Peace. Okay, but while America was focusing on that, on rational solutions, it wasn't keeping its eye on the developing problems in Europe and the fact that not everybody was on board and people still wanted power, and it put us behind in our preparation. Because we had expectations like Neville Chamberlain had when he tried to negotiate with Adolf Hitler, and thought that Hitler would be reasonable. So Morgenthau, learning from that history, was more like Machiavelli than like Plato, and criticized the idealistic leaders. He said that we can never maintain peace through agreements, okay? International relations will always be about power politics. We can never maintain peace through agreements. Now you may be thinking, well, what about treaties? Well, Morgenthau said treaties are only as good as the will of the countries at the time. And by the way, they're always incomplete. They're always amongst 2 or 3 countries. If they're amongst more, then we got the problem that we've already described, that you can't have that level of cooperation amongst many countries. Okay? But a treaty between 2 powers or 3 powers or so forth is a very temporary thing, and it lasts only as long as the interests of the parties involved. Okay? So agreements can never lead to a lasting peace. So how do we get peace? He said, well, peace must be based upon fear. Okay? And that may seem kind of counterintuitive in a way, but what he said was only if governments are formidable enough that to fight them will be too frightening to their enemies, where the consequences of attack are too much to be considered, will you have lasting peace. Okay? And so, in other words, your enemy has to think twice, long and hard, and think about the consequences of attacking. Okay? That is a better foundation for peace than simple agreements. Okay? So that's why he wrote In Defense of the National Interest. It's a book about American foreign policy, where he talks about the need for America to have a strong national defense and to be more concerned about its own national defense than about world peace, because actually, in his view, the two were tied together. If America had a strong national defense, you'd be more likely to have world peace than if America was vulnerable. So Augustine's position is very similar. He says there can be no real peace in this life. There can be truces. There can be temporary agreements. He would also agree with Morgenthau that the best road to peace for any given country is to have a strong national defense, and this is one of the duties of government, is to have a strong national defense. True peace, real peace, Augustine said, is produced by justice, and that's something that rarely exists in this world. Okay? If we were to have true peace, it would be through perfect justice, where everyone was given what they deserved, okay? And where people were treated equally, okay? But he doesn't think that's a possibility on this planet, true justice only exists in the next life when God rules and God can sort out the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. Okay? So Morgenthau and Augustine agree on this. Morgenthau would have no trouble with that conclusion, that real peace is produced by justice, because he agrees with Augustine that justice can't exist in this world. So we have to have a fallback, right? And the fallback is the national defense. Okay? Now, you may ask yourself, well, why is Morgenthau so interested in just the defense of one country? Wouldn't a truly moral thinker, or in Augustine's case, wouldn't a truly Christian thinker be concerned about the defense of other countries as well? Okay? Well, in a way, both of them are, but they recognize that there are limits to what any leader or any particular country can actually do. See? So if you're the leader of a particular country, you have a moral obligation to defend your country because that's what you have some control over. Okay? You have far less control of the world community. Okay? You have next to no control over some of these people. Okay? You may have some influence, but that's about all you can hope for. So Morgenthau said that our president, for instance, has a moral obligation to defend this country. That's his top priority. And I wanted to ask you if you thought that was morally defensible. Is that a good moral position to say the top priority must be the defense of your own country? Okay.
It's kind of pretty common sense.
Mm-hmm.
You can't really, it's the whole thing, like you need to fix what's in your own home or your backyard before you start messing with someone else's. So if you can't even defend yourself, how are you going to actually defend others, like those same countries? So if we can't defend our own borders, how are we going to protect other countries?
Right. If we can't do that, we can't do the other. That's a good point. Can you see how somebody might object and say, but while you're defending your borders, you have to beef up your security and your ability to defend yourself. That produces a reaction in other countries, could actually cause conflict. And because you're defending yourself, you cause suspicion on the part of other countries. Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, in North Korea right now,
yeah,
we're sending in like all of our bombers.
That's a great example.
All of our B-52s and B-2s, and North Korea just finds that completely unacceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he does not like that at all. It's predictable, and I think Obama is doing what most American presidents would do. When somebody makes a threat like that, it never pays to just blow it off. You may think, there's no way, this guy doesn't even have the ability. They tried to test missiles a while ago, and they didn't even complete their course. So probably he doesn't have the ability to do anything. But if we do nothing, if we don't show our power, that sends a signal not only to him but to the rest of the world that we are vulnerable. So the logical response is to do this. But then, of course, he's all angry. This produces, I've got to do something. I've got to show, I'm serious, right? So the potential for conflict actually increases a little bit as he sorts out, whether he's going to be sensible and back down, or whether he's going to, and the unknown element is the other leader sensible at all? Now, actually, most are. When they're faced with this amount of force, most people will, if they may get very angry and they bluster and they try to do something short of actually a warlike act, but they'll back down because they see if they don't, they might just be destroyed. On the other hand, there's also the crazy element, right? And where you can't predict what this person will do. And so there's always, a chance of conflict whenever you do something like this. But what else are you going to do? I mean, Morgenthau is very good at showing you the dilemma that these leaders are placed in. Okay, you can't not do anything. After 9/11, people argue about whether we did the right thing, but the worst thing we could have done is probably nothing. Something had to be done because you have to have a response to these types of things, or else you'll send the message that you're very vulnerable, you're weak, because there's so many people in the world who think that way. So Morgenthau would say it is morally defensible. He was totally able to see the moral ambiguity too, though, and to see that, yes, it does sometimes include increasing suspicion and so forth. But he says leaders really don't have much choice.
So he would say what Bush did was a moral obligation to the country.
Yes, maybe not in the particulars. We could argue about the particulars, but he would say Bush had a moral obligation to do something to as a response to this act, or else he would be inviting more attacks. Right. So he did the right thing at that level anyway. And actually, almost everybody agrees with that because it is kind of a common sense thing. But they argue about what he did, the particular things that he did and how he did them and so forth. But if you don't respond somehow, then basically you invite more conflict by sending the message to your enemy, just come and get me. We're paper tigers, as they say, right? So to that extent, I tried to explain this to people at the time. I said, well, I'm not in his office and I'd hate to be there, but, and he may not have made the perfectly right decision in all respects. And of course, Monday morning quarterbacking is always fun, but something had to be done. And it was almost more important for something to be done than anything else, because to do nothing just wasn't acceptable. So he points out, we cannot control the world community. Okay? And that's similar to what Augustine says about all of the divisions that we have, that we cannot really communicate with each other well enough to be able to solve all of our problems through sitting down, okay, face to face. Some people continue to believe that's possible, and I think, people like Morgenthau just vociferously disagree. They say, there is no amount of talking with the situation of the world the way it is that will yield to peace. So his moral obligation lies with what he can control, even if it is at the expense, he says, of other nations' well-being. Okay? And I just put an example there, and it does kind of remind us of what's happening right now, actually. President pursuing the moral aim of safety for his own people may propose the construction of more weapons or the placement of them or the expansion of military forces. This has the effect of making the world more dangerous at one level, but his own nation safer at another. Okay? So this may be frustrating, right? Because it doesn't seem like there's ever any end to it. My mom's 85 years old now, and she often says, I am so disgusted with people. There doesn't seem to ever be any end to conflict. They just start the same conflicts up over and over and over again, and we don't seem to be getting any smarter about it all. And Morgenthau would agree with that. There doesn't seem to be a way out. Okay, I just put this up here to give you a understanding of the sophistication of his view of ethics and politics. He understands that his position has problems and does cause more problems, and that this is a tragic dilemma. He calls it a tragic choice that leaders have to make to keep their own people safe. He says there is no escape from the evil of power, regardless of what one does. Whenever we act with reference to our fellow men, we must sin, and we must sin when we refuse to act, for the refusal to be involved in the evil of action carries with it the breach of the obligation to do one's duty, which is what we were talking about. No ivory tower is remote enough to offer protection against the guilt in which the actor and the bystander, the oppressor and the oppressed, the murderer and his victim are inextricably meshed. Political ethics is indeed the ethics of doing evil. While it condemns politics as the domain of evil par excellence, it must reconcile itself to the enduring presence of evil in all political action. Its last resort, then, is the endeavor to choose, since evil there must be, among several actions, the one that is the least evil. Okay? Now, one thing that Morgenthau proposes, which goes a step beyond this, and which he spent a lot of his career developing, was a foreign policy of choice, which he called the balance of power. The balance of power foreign policy. Okay? Now, he noted that there's a natural tendency for nations to balance power with power. When one nation arms up, the neighboring nations do as well in order to try to protect themselves. So there's that, which we sometimes call an arms race when it gets out of hand, right? But he said that at certain times, he did a lot of historical research, and at certain times in history, he could see countries actually pursuing a conscious balance of power foreign policy, where they did not simply ratchet up their power to the maximum and frighten others, but in conjunction with negotiation and continuous communication, they would keep their forces high enough to equal and balance the threat from their neighbors. Okay? It's a difficult thing to do, to balance the power of your neighbors or other threatening nations without going overboard and scaring them into ratcheting theirs even up further. Okay? And it does involve continual negotiations and communication. Okay? Communications and openness about what you've got, basically. Okay? So that they know and you know. And he says it only can happen under certain conditions. There were certain periods of time when Great Britain was able to do a balance of power foreign policy with potential European rivals, for instance. And the United States practiced balance of power foreign policy when it finally realized that China and the communist China and communist Soviet Union were not on the same page but could be pitted against each other. Okay? So that is a foreign policy of choice for Morgenthau, which goes a little bit beyond the narrow focus on just your country's safety, with a concerted effort to basically, through negotiations and diplomacy, let other countries know what you're capable of, what your intentions are, that you don't want to dominate, but you will, protect yourself, and you have the means to do so. Okay? And involves continual adjustment to their own power and their own threat. Okay? So, pursuing through actions and diplomacy an actual rough balance of weaponry among the great powers. Okay? And he thought that was the best we could do. No, that was the very best. And a lot of times it wasn't possible. But when possible, and this is another interesting parallel with Augustine. Remember, Augustine says, when possible, you should seek every means short of conflict, right? As long as doing that doesn't interfere with your country's ability to successfully defend itself. So when possible, Morgenthau said, try to pursue a policy of balancing, because it's the most likely to, at least for a longer period of time, bring peace. Now, it doesn't respond well to the crazy factor, and that's the one thing. It still relies upon reason, even if it's reason following passion. The leaders all want power, they want to be respected, they want to have influence in the world. And most of them can see how it's not in their interest to invite unnecessary conflict. But there are people like Kim Jong-un or Adolf Hitler who seem irrational to the point where you can't predict what they will do. Okay? And there is no good way to handle those types of leaders. Mm-hmm.
So would Augustine say what Hitler did to kind of not turn the other cheek, but kind of just to let it be, because that's the regime, that was, that's what was happening in Germany, so kind of just let it be type of thing?
I'm not sure I follow your question exactly.
Let me word it. Let me try to word
it. Okay. Want me to come back?
Yeah.
He's
Okay.
How he obviously said accept.
Yeah, Like how Augustine says, just like accept how governments are. Like that's because that's how the way God intended it to be.
Ah, yeah.
So what would he say towards?
Oh, I got you. What would he say to a regime as bad as Hitler's?
Yeah.
That would be a very, and this is why I don't think Augustine's doctrine is perfect, because it cannot handle your question well. Because ultimately he does say all governments on earth are placed there by God, and you cannot resist. Now, he had seen some nasty government with some of the, tyrannical Roman rulers, but he'd never seen anything like that. No one ever had, and it really is the ultimate challenge to any way of thinking like that. So I would like to think that he would reevaluate, because that cannot be accepted under any circumstances. Could it be?
Because that's definitely not just.
Seen as God's will, yeah. If that's God's will, then God isn't worth respecting. You know what I mean? So it has to be reevaluated, and I don't think that personally, I don't think that part of Augustine's thought is well developed enough or takes enough of these problems into account. So, but I'd like to think that confronted with that he would back off and think again. Yeah. Because as it is, to say that Hitler's regime is a part of God's plan for whatever reason, is just unacceptable. Yeah. I see your question. That's a very good question. Later Christian thinkers dealt with these issues better by really emphasizing the free will, okay? By saying, God set up the world, but because he gave us free will, he is not in control of everything. He's in control of it to the extent that he allows us to have free will, right? But then because we have free will, we can use our power for great good or great evil. When for great evil, then God would condemn it, okay? And therefore, people can fight against it. That's a much more legitimate position, and it reflects more the reality of the human condition. When we see something that goes against our religious or moral principles, and we can't do anything about it, or think we can't, there's something gravely wrong with that position. And I think most future Christian thinkers saw that, not all, but a lot of them. Yeah.
So I don't know if you heard in the news and stuff, but like the new Pope from Argentina, he was there's accusations saying that he was very well aware of what was happening in Argentina during the Dirty War. Mm-hmm. So in that case, because there's God involved in there, so this Pope kind of turned his cheek to that.
Well, yeah, there's differing views of what he did. His response is he worked behind the scenes, that he felt like he was in a better position rather than basically rebelling openly and getting killed or getting other people killed, that he worked behind the scenes as much as possible to protect people and to, object and so forth. So that's his position. And that is a dilemma that people in situations like that face, is what do you do? I mean, what is the best approach given a powerful tyrannical government that you happen to be living under? If you openly rebel, you may just get yourself killed, in which case you've then ended the possibility for change or for any sort of good actions on your part. So, but on the other hand, if such a person just acquiesced and didn't do anything even behind the scenes and just sort of allowed the power to frighten him, then truly, he would be in the wrong. But he claims that he did. Yeah. But would Augustine approve? Again, that's a great example of, would he approve of acquiescence in that case? You'd like to think not, but given what he states, he just might have to. It's a real problem for him. Yeah. Because like I said, future Christian thinkers could see that there comes a point when government asks you to do something that's totally unjust and wrong and goes against your Christian beliefs. You can't do it. There's a long, even he knew, history of martyrs from the previous Christian persecution who refused to obey the Roman government and died as a result. So, yeah, I don't think he solved all problems with his thought. Yeah.